Absolutely delighted, everybody, to introduce Detective Chief Superintendent Andy Cox, Head of Crime and Intelligence, Lincolnshire Police. And Andy formerly led the Vision for Vision Zero road death and transport crime investigation in the Metropolitan Police. Andy, over to you. Very much looking forward to hear what you've got to say.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm really pleased to be here, and morning, everybody. Apologies for the angle of the camera. My Wi-Fi dropped, so I've had to change to my mobile phone, and it's only getting a signal in my youngest boy's bedroom. So apologies for that, everybody. As you said, so I led Vision Zero, which is our road danger reduction program across London. I moved into that post at the start of 2019, but I had worked in collision investigation in London from 2017. It's a portfolio really close to my heart. I think there's loads that we can do, and obviously I'm going to talk through what we've done essentially over the last 18 months in London. I've now moved to Lincolnshire to take up a head of crime job, but I have kept the national portfolio for England and Wales around collision investigations, so still have an active role and voice in road safety. But when I started the portfolio at the start of 2019 on Vision Zero, what did I find? I found a strategy essentially that targeted everyone, everywhere and everything. By that, I mean, it wasn't intelligence led. I think the agenda for road safety needed somebody to speak publicly on that. I found that the public perception of traffic officers, for example, was, one that you're raising revenue. Why don't you go and fight crime? It didn't see the crucial role the roads policing officers, stroke traffic officers play in terms of keeping people safe, protecting life, and actually tackling criminality. So I was really keen that we change that perception. To do so, I went on social media. So I will be using that hashtag in a minute, but essentially was really positive in terms of role it played, tried to change culture, behaviours, and speak to several groups of different people. So number one, speak to law-abiding road user and say that we were there to support them. Two, to recognise the impact and devastation caused by dangerous drivers to families and to the community. So to speak for essentially bereaved families or seriously injured people. Three, to talk direct to offenders, to try to make them aware actually speeding, actually driving dangerously, of the impacts it can have on communities, and to also draw that links that's so often present between the dangerous driver and other forms of criminality, to make sure the public understood that actually this is fighting crime as well. So we moved to a strategy where we targeted the most risky people, the most risky places and the most risky themes. That sounds really obvious thing to do, but broadly up and down the country, I have to say that's not necessarily the case for roads policing. I've certainly made it the case in London, and I know that is operating elsewhere now, but I think it needs to be more consistent across the country, and I'll talk through that in a second. But what I'm going to do just essentially is run through our Vision Zero approach and obviously draw a link specifically to cycling as we go. But in terms of the most obvious theme that stands out, and so often this is debated, but it really should not be debated now. Speed is undoubtedly the most dangerous risk to safety on our roads. We've looked at the Department for Transport stats, we've reviewed them, and they essentially work off data first produced by the officer that attends the initial scene of the collision. What we did in London last year is move that to the back stage. So essentially once we'd fully investigated a fatal collision, the causation of that collision obviously becomes far more obvious than it does at the start. And we found that speed was by far the most frequent causation factor, and it's present in just under 1 in 2. So essentially half of our collisions in London had speed as a factor, which therefore gave me the legitimacy and the proportionality to target speeding drivers, which I've been doing essentially as part of our strategy for the last 18 months or so. And I think the pandemic brought this whole issue to the attention nationally. I think road safety, stroke roads policing had a moment in the pandemic that really got the public attention. We had some absolutely outrageous speeds in London. We had 163 miles an hour on a tea time at a weekend. We had 134 miles an hour on a 40. We had 94 and a 20. So when you start to break down, and that was not unusual, they were not specifically outrageous speeds to the ones that we would otherwise expect to find. We've caught in a short period of time during 2020 close to 1,000 people now doing 100 miles an hour or more. So the whole strategy really moved from that where we target everybody to really focusing in on, as I said earlier, the most risky roads, the most risky drivers, and focusing on speed. We also do the other fatal 4 activities. I'm sure people recognise what they are. But like I said, with that focus on speed, we feel we've had a really dramatic impact on the whole road safety outcomes in London. So if we then take it on a different level to really support the type of roads where we focus on, so 20 and 30 mile an hour zones we moved heavily into. Why did we do that? Because firstly, most the killed and serious injury collisions occur on 20 and 30 mile an hour roads in London. So let's remove that myth that they only occur on fast roads or on the more sort of speedy roads. We found that from the data that we used that it was in 20 and 30 mile an hour zones they're most likely to be. That made us really, again, legitimise enforcement in 20 mile an hour zones. And our enforcement in those 20 mile an hour zones rocketed up about 700-800% this calendar year compared to last. Speeding as a whole, our previous highest ever enforcement year for London of any year, so highest ever year in terms of boots on the ground enforcement for speed, was 12,000. When I left the post in August, we'd already done 22,000. So in mid-August, we'd nearly doubled our highest ever previous year. So you can see our sense of urgency around tackling speed. And when we start talking about enforcement on 20 and 30 mile an hour roads, they are just so dramatically higher. Why do we do that? Obviously to support vulnerable road users. So that is your cyclist, of course, but also your pedestrian. And I really think one of the big issues for us here is the whole culture of the driver. So the driver so often, in my opinion, when we talk about cycling, thinks it has an absolute automatic right to overtake the cyclist. It shows no patience. And I'm talking here, obviously, not everybody, but a hardcore of dangerous drivers think it's their right to automatically get past the cyclist. They're prepared to nip round them when there's oncoming traffic, when there isn't sufficient space. And so often, which is just incredibly frustrating, they will wait at the junction, the road slightly ahead. The cyclist will catch them up and the cyclist will then get back ahead of them again. And then the same thing happens again, as the driver thinks they have an automatic right to get past the cyclist. So that's a culture we really need to address. I think driving culture is the big issue here, and the public perception. I so often draw a link to the drink driving element to this. Drink driving throughout my adulthood has been rightly seen as socially unacceptable, yet speeding is not. And I've already said to you today that speeding is by far the most frequent cause of fatal collisions. That person who is prepared to challenge their friend, their family member, their work colleague for about their drink driving, will try and take their keys off them, will do everything they can rightly to try and stop that person getting in the car whilst drunk. They're not, though, challenging their friends, their family, their work colleague not to speed. And they really need to change that culture. We need to change that culture. I've been calling it out. I know everybody on here is clearly road safety minded. I'm sure you'll call it out, but we need to make that widespread. We need to make that culture shift. We need marketing on it. We need everything we can to make people realise surely the purpose of their journey is to go from A to B safely. It's not to be subject to police enforcement. It's not to be subject to a collision that has potentially fatal or life-changing consequences. And I've met so many people who, in hindsight, have reflected on their driving once the collisions occurred. And of course, they can't turn back the clock. So, and I think people have that complacent, arrogant driving culture that, unfortunately, for some, it devastates them, and it devastates their family, it devastates their lives, it devastates everything about their future. And of course, they can't turn back that clock. Yeah, if they'd have been prepared to drive just that bit slower, drive more sensibly, they'd have got there safely and their life would have been unaffected. So that's the really strong message that we've taken forward in London. We've enforced more than, as I said, on speed than ever before. We've targeted roads such as the A10. I use this as an example where our intelligence identified out of 9,000 roads, 132 that had most of the killed and serious injury collisions that occurred in London. So essentially being intelligence led, as I said earlier, to identify the right road. And then we had a few that stood out, like the A10, where we essentially policed at the right time, the right place. We marketed it to everybody that we were there. We did so not to frustrate our attempts to catch people, but to actually stop people driving dangerously in the first place. And that was clearly our belief, that it was prevention rather than detection. But we marketed the results we were getting. And in the first period of time, and this was a road that had substantial killed and serious injury history, it had substantial community concerns about it. We marketed our impact there, and initially we caught loads and loads and loads and loads. Some outrageous speeds, outrageous drive, and we seized a load of vehicles. We used a range of different tactics as well. So we put drones up as well, just to try and create that perception that the driver really didn't know when we were there and when we'd enforce, but they feared it the whole time. And over the course of about 18 months, fatal and serious injury collisions have absolutely collapsed in terms of their compared to previous periods and previous years. So we have substantially proved the point that if you have a visible policing presence in the right place at the right time, you communicate it, you tell everybody you can about it, you do have an impact in terms of changing behaviour, changing driving culture for that particular area, and having an impact. And we've essentially proved the point that if you're intelligence led on targeting the right driver, the right place and the right issue, you can have a killed and serious injury benefit, because our killed and serious injuries are the lowest they've ever been, and they were last year. So now and people will point to the pandemic, of course they will, but we know that speeding during that period of time was especially dangerous, and other parts of our country have experienced a rise in killed and serious injuries. So we need to sort of reduce that or remove that myth and just focus on the tactics that have worked and repeat them elsewhere. If I talk now, if I can, just around some of the legislative changes I'd like to see as well. So if we compare the speeding driver, extreme speeding driver to somebody that carries a knife out onto the street, if the police stop the person carrying a knife on the street, there is rightly the opportunity to see that person severely sentenced. So all of our criminal justice processes has the options, if they so chose. It doesn't mean they will, of course, but they have the option to sentence that individual severely. If we catch somebody doing extreme speeding, and of course we've caught more than ever this year, so the 163 mile an hour driver, for example, I think somebody did 200 in Sussex miles an hour. So those sorts of people, of course, the impact is equally potentially severe as somebody that carries a knife, and arguably substantially more severe. So if we imagine 163 mile an hour at tea time on a weekend and London suddenly goes around the corner and there's traffic that's come to a standstill, we can all imagine the devastation that would cause to multiple different families. Yet the sentencing options for that person are only severe once a crash has occurred. So what I'm talking essentially to legislators about is we need to have that preventative deterrence as well. So a much stronger capability around sentencing that perhaps allows us to seize that vehicle off the speeding driver, that allows us to remove their license more readily, but allows us to have some more severe sanctions as well. And I think that's about drawing the link so often missed by the media and by the public themselves. You know, when we see substantial amounts of media coverage for knife crime, for murder, for terrorism, but when I say more people in this country have died every single year since records have began, based on road collisions, than they have because of murder or terrorism combined for the country, then I think we need that understanding to make sure people just don't assume road fatality is an inevitability and just an acceptable detriment to our driving culture across the country, when it should never be inevitable. And we can, as Vision Zero hopes to achieve, i.e. get to zero fatal collisions in London, and that should of course be elsewhere. So we need to change that culture, and I think stronger sentencing would help with that. It absolutely is galling for road policing officers who stop that driver doing extreme speed to issue them a summons to court, but to then see them drive off 5 minutes later after we leave them at the roadside. It just doesn't feel right to me. So I think there's legislative changes we can make, and that all goes back to the culture of driving, the messages that we need to take forward, and the whole deterrence factor as part of that. But just briefly touch on criminality. So we introduced something called the Road Crime Team in April. That was carefully named. Words do matter, and we need to associate dangerous driving with criminality. So hence it was called the Road Crime Team. That was a small team of officers who essentially targeted the most dangerous drivers. In a very short period of time, we have seized hundreds of vehicles from dangerous drivers. We've made hundreds of arrests. And this, I say, is a small team within our broader roads policing function. But arrests for things like, so a speeding driver, we identified somebody that had been wanted for 6 months for attempted murder. We caught them through speeding driving. We've arrested people who are carrying knives, guns, drugs, counterfeit currency, stolen vehicles, just through targeting the most dangerous drivers. So we, of course, use technology, i.e. our ANPR cameras. We use our intelligence to identify these drivers. We seek to take their license off them at every opportunity and take their car. And that small team can make a really significant impact. And I think this goes back to winning the public support as well for law-abiding road users, to demonstrate to them that this isn't about simple roads traffic enforcement. This is about protection of life and tackling criminality. So having a very, very focused team who tackle the most dangerous drivers, who are hardened criminals, who do not care about safe driving, that actually sends out a dual message that this is about fighting crime and keeping people safe. Moving on to dash cam and head cam. So when I first took up post, as I said at the start of 2019, I asked what are the means for the public to report road safety offences to us, traffic offences, traffic crimes to us. And we had an online portal facility. I said, okay, what have we done to market that? And there was silence in the room and a few looks of surprise and horror, to be honest. And that's going to create work, was the sort of perception. Are we really going to encourage that? And of course, I absolutely wanted to encourage it. The police are a very, very small part of any complete road danger reduction / road safety function. It's obviously incumbent on everybody, and therefore I wanted the public to be able to play their part and be part of the solution. I think most importantly, the message that sends is deterrence, because whilst the police can't be everywhere all of the time, the public can be. And I think by creating an impression with the public that actually, and dangerous drivers specifically, that, and I'll try and get into their mindset, and I believe their mindset is one that looks for the camera, it looks for the police officer, and if they see neither, they think, okay, well, I can drive however I like. And of course, what we've done by promoting dash cam and head cam and making that more in the public conscience is hopefully influence some, and there's certainly some evidence it has, to drive more safely, because they fear that the member of the public next to them in the car is going to be the one that does enforce essentially against them by reporting their footage and capturing it through, whether that's dash cam or head cam, or just even, in fact, any electronic device. So a pedestrian on the pavement with a phone, for example, can report and has reported and allowed us to enforce against those drivers. So in 2018, we reported about 4,000 to 5,000, or the public did, sorry, to us in London, about 4,000 to 5,000 dash cam, head cam, or any other footage of road traffic offences to us. In 2019, we now start to market it, and that was through social media, through my account, through the Met's wider account. But we also, for example, approached the Evening Standard. We got into the Times. We got everywhere we could to market the fact we wanted dash cam. That rose to nearly 10,000 reports. And certainly this year, we're on course, despite the pandemic. Of course, with less of us about to actually capture some of this footage. We're on course to dramatically increase that again. I think we were tracking towards 30,000 certainly at one point in the year. So I think that's the important message here as well, is this isn't footage that just comes in and is of no use or viability to us. We enforce about 2/3 of the footage we receive. So it does lead to people losing their license. It does lead to people having significant fines and court costs. So there is an impact to the driver. And in London, we really think, we should update people that report as well. And I think some parts of the country don't. Some parts of the country, in fact, don't enable this footage. And I really stress that that's a postcode lottery. So London's drivers drive elsewhere, and people outside of London clearly drive into London. So It shouldn't be a postcode lottery. It should be nationally consistent, in my view. It is a fantastic deterrence tool. It does allow us to enforce. It has crash investigation benefits as well. I certainly know of the most devastating of collisions that have benefited from dash cam footage to help the investigation. So I think there's no detriment to supporting the public being part of the solution by reporting offences to us. And as I said, we got 2/3 of that footage. We do update the reporting person. So we do so to A, because it's polite, and I think it's rude not to, but B, to actually educate them, because I think if footage was submitted and the individual doesn't know if it's been used, doesn't know if it was of any use whatsoever, A, they're not likely to repeat that submission because, as I said earlier, it's rude, but B, they don't know if it's been worthwhile. And actually, if they do submit footage which isn't evidentially helpful or useful or viable, then we need to tell them that so that they understand that for next time, so it becomes a more efficient process. So we've certainly got a policy around updating, and I hope that goes out nationally. And I'm certainly trying to influence a national use of dash cam / head cam, and a national compliance around how we do it to make it consistent and helpful for people that take the time to report. In terms of just taking that step further, in fact, in terms of the thing for me as well, in terms of future, I think manufacturers should try and get dash cam as standard in their cars. I think insurers should incentivize it. I'm obviously really keen to see cyclists use head cam, or however you wish to describe it, but basically have a camera capability for yourselves. I think drivers, when they see it, are very conscious of it and drive more safely around you. It also allows us to take action against drivers who frankly put you at risk. And we have got absolute evidence where we've had people that have reported footage in London who have then, cyclists in London who have reported footage saying, given us evidence against the driver, and then have subsequently told us that same driver has now gone past them and has drove completely differently. So it does work. It won't work in every case, but in my opinion, it does make you safe, and it makes cycling per se safer. I think just coming on to cycling, if I can, which is obviously the purpose of the conference, so I suppose I better cover that. We've got a real need, in my view, to police differently around this. So I've been really, really keen to stress we have a proportionate policy of enforcement. So perhaps in the past, said earlier, we policed everyone, everything, and everywhere. I've gone away from that, and I've very much had, as I said, an intelligence-led focus. So cyclists do themselves present risk. Of course they do if they commit offences. So if they go through the traffic lights that are red, if they cycle on the pavement aggressively, if they cycle dangerously in any way, shape or form, of course they present risk to other people. And there are examples of people that have been hurt, and in fact fatally hurt, by a cyclist who was driving, cycling illegally. So of course there is risk. It is a very minor risk though in comparison to the risk that drivers present, and the data of course backs that up. So we will have, hopefully for the first time ever, under 100 fatal collisions in London this year. One of them so far relates to a cyclist who caused the collision. In previous years the ratios would be the same or less. So what I've done is make sure our enforcement ratios reflect that. So we do enforce cycling offences, we do enforce people that go through red lights, but we do so proportionately. So it equates to about 1 to 2% tops of our enforcement. And that does cause some angst with drivers, but I always talk to them about that proportionate approach to it and explain the ratios. And I'm completely happy to stand up and justify that to anybody. But of course, I do ask cyclists to respect the law, because actually the main purpose of doing so is about protection of themselves. So our focus with a dedicated cycling safety team that we have in London, we have the luxury of having that, is to make sure the cycle safety team police the right zones to protect the cyclists, work with the local county councils to influence infrastructure, to work with cyclists themselves to have a preventative agenda, and occasionally do enforcement against cyclists, but more ordinarily do enforcement against the driver to keep people safe. And that's all about that proportionate ratio. And we do try and encourage the infrastructure, and we have a very great working relationship with Transport for London. They've got a cycling commissioner, Will Norman, who is a real sort of creative force in London in terms of cycle safety. And we want to make it the norm. So we want infrastructure through dedicated cycle lanes that keeps people safe, makes that the norm. And then, of course, drivers will understand that they expect to see a cyclist, and this is how we have to drive around the cyclist, and it promotes a whole safety culture. So I think infrastructure is really important. And then back to culture. So one thing I've been really, really keen to advocate is not to victim blame. So those who follow me on social media would have seen some of this recently, and I didn't quite get the tweet right in fairness, but essentially what I was trying to say is the cause of fatal collisions is involving a dangerous driver, is the dangerous driver. It is not somebody not wearing a high vis or not wearing a helmet. So the cause is the dangerous driver, and I don't want to victim blame. So I think that's a really important message, if I can, just to conclude on. But I would just finalise by saying, this approach, which has engaged the public, which has engaged cyclists themselves, hasn't been really, we've got an independent advisory group involving all of our partners. We've tried a really open approach. We've communicated every single day, but most importantly, and the good news, I think, of the approach that we've taken is killed and serious injury collisions are at the lowest they've ever been in London. And I think it shows it's not an inevitability and it can be prevented. And that's really where we need to go collectively as a nation in the future.
DCS Cox, Andy, thank you so much. Some amazing insights there, I think, into some of the things that many of us have been observing over recent months and the efforts that you're making to begin to tackle many of those. Dave Brennan, who's a helmet cyclist, he's very frustrated, I think, by the poor responses that he's getting from our police force in Scotland. Really, he'd be very keen to hear from you about what the best evidence we could share is to encourage Police Scotland to set up the kind of online submission scheme that you describe.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm really happy to be involved in that conversation. I think it's a really simple approach. We've got an online facility which takes about 10 minutes for the user to complete their download and their refer their evidence to us, their footage to us. It's no more than 10 minutes. It's really straightforward. We then operate off that, and we tell them the outcome. We take action if we need to, and it's just about. And I understand every police jurisdiction has its pressures. We could probably talk a lot about police resourcing and finance and other bits, but in reality, as I said earlier, what greater priority is there when you factor in the potential for fatality versus murder terrorism? You then factor in public being part of that solution. You've got more eyes on the roads. You'll make a safer road environment for all, in my opinion, by having an approach to use dash cam and head cam. So I do encourage every force to do it. I am pushing for that within England and Wales nationally, and I'm really, really happy to link anybody in from this, Police Scotland, to the approach that we used in the Met to share everything that we've used there. And it's a very, very simple process and it's cost effective.
Terrific. Paul Rimmer is asking about, given the sort of angry reactions that we're seeing on social media to posts about the close pass enforcements, how are we going to bring these two sides together? And what might be your ideas around that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, it ultimately is just about talking about it, I think, and trying to change that culture. So I always refer to the person that is aggressive, that gets past that cyclist, who takes that risk to get past them because they feel they have a right to do so, which of course they don't. And they end up waiting at the junction and the cyclist catches them back up. So I think it's not just the driver versus cycling culture. I think it's just the driving culture, frankly. And I think we really need to address that purpose of the journey is from A to B safely, without police enforcement, which runs the risk of you having a fine, losing your license, having higher insurance costs, having all the employment challenges that come from the fact you may have lost your license and what that means to your family and yourself. Plus, of course, all the collision dangers that come from it. So I think we need to address the issue that speeding and even just those mile or two above the limit has a risk that does devastate families. So address that part, draw the link to police enforcement part, and ultimately draw the link to the purpose of any journey is to arrive safely. And I think once we change that complacent, arrogant culture, you'll have substantially safer roads. So I think really is a broader message that everybody needs to buy into, which I said earlier, which draws that link to we're happy to challenge and call out drink drivers, but the culture is not yet happy to challenge speeding drivers, and it needs to do the same in regard.
Thank you. And a very brief final question, just going to slot this one in. Tricia Fort is asking if the reduction in call-outs and costs for other emergency services, i.e. fire and ambulance, has been calculated, given how many collisions that you and your team have prevented.
Yeah, it'd be absolutely vast. So I think that's a really good point, because what COVID did do is draw the link between the dangerous driver and the NHS. And of course, with the dangers that COVID had for people with underlying health issues. So if, for example, you were a speeding driver and you involved yourself in a serious or fatal crash, you're of course obstructing all the emergency services, obstructing the NHS and putting people at more risk because they'd be going into a place where COVID was more prevalent. So I think the link to all the emergency services, the link to that risk has been highlighted more through the COVID pandemic and the lockdown period. But the costs are just extravagant. I mean, I suppose it's almost untold, and it's really hard to prove the reduction is for a specific issue. But the data doesn't lie over a period of time, and I think if we take this approach into the long term, the gains will continue to be had. But it's really incumbent. I suppose the message I'd really like to leave with is incumbent on everybody. The police play a very small part in this, and I play a very small part in this, but actually we all have a part to play.
What a fantastic message to finish off with. DCS Cox, thank you very much indeed for your time and absolutely terrific insight into some of the tremendous work you're doing. We're all in this together. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.